Welcome everyone, today we have a new guide for Diablo 4. Now in this video, we're looking at two very special parts about the game. The first part is about the PvP part of the game, and also the second part, we're looking at the hardcore of Diablo 4. So this video will be broken down into several parts. On the first part, we'll have a look at the tier list I made about those parts of the game, and we'll briefly talk about this for each of the class. On the second part, we'll look at each of the class builds in details into which of the build can be very good in terms of PvP, and which of the skills can be good in terms of hardcore. So I know I'm a little ambitious with this video, so make sure you guys use the timestamps for different parts of the video. So coming over to a tier list over here, if you guys do want to see the full results of the tier list, we have had a previous video over here which where I talk about the tier list into details. During this tier list, I didn't get to talk about PvP or hardcore that much. And this will be a brief summary of course. So as in terms of PvP, we'll look into the skills and so choices very soon, I'll show you guys. And I do feel like I don't give some classes enough just. So over here I'll do some live updates because I was giving the melee class a really low ranking initially. So the first thing about PvP is that you do want to keep your distance. Usually when players versus players, the one who can spam the most spells at a distance usually get an advantage. So before you react, you can be losing half of life, or you can be dealing half of the life against enemies. After that, the PvP classes will also look who can have the most unstoppableness. With unstoppable, you are immune to the crowd control, and this allows you to either control enemies or be not controlled by enemies. And finally, we'll look into mobility. Because in terms of PvP, you're going to see in the builds very soon, you're going to see a lot of classes we want to build in terms of mobility, stun resistance, slow resistance, and the ability to disable enemies. So it's like going to be pretty fun for PvP. And on top of that, you also want to be killing monsters while doing PvP. Because if you guys remember in the live stream, in the PvP zone, there's going to be a lot more monsters, higher density of monsters, so you can be farming monsters or farming players. Now, one of the reasons I gave Barbarian and also Druid 7 is because of their class nature. They are a little slower sometimes because they're melee class, and also they tend to be the one that's getting attacked upon. The first time you see an enemy, usually for Druid and also Barbarian, most of your skills are melee, while the other classes, even Rogue, can be a range class. And this allows the enemy to have the upper hand first, and it's quite important for us to build into the resistance to stuns and also disables, and also unstoppableness for those two classes. Now as for the Sorcerers and also for the Rogue, both of those have some really good utility in terms of defensive capacities, in terms of mobility, and also range damage. And there's a lot of disables, so that's why I ranked them a little highly. And as you guys gonna see in the builds over here for each of the classes, you're gonna see that some classes will be focused on surviving, like the Necromancer, while other classes will be focused on dealing more damage instantly and killing the enemy. Now finally for the Necromancer, this one is a little interesting because you can either be using your minions or using yourself. Here I try to use a combination of both. So the Necromancer build I have ready for you guys is going to be a Blood Necromancer, which allows us to be very survivable, great in terms of group team fights, and also have a lot of sustain. So if enemies can't kill you, once they lose all the cooldowns, you'll slowly water them down, and you can do a lot of damage and also lifesteal a lot. So now let's come over to each of the class build I have for you guys briefly. So over here, I didn't go into the legendaries, I didn't go into the paragons, we're just going to look at the skills. And this is a theory crafting for each of the class. I'm not saying this is going to be the best PvP skill, but hopefully this gives you guys an understanding of my own concept of the theory crafting to prepare for PvP, because I think that's going to be really fun in the game. So as for the Barbarian, I like to go with Launch Strike, which allows us to get close to enemies. And this also provides us with a bit of healing. Over here, I decided to go with the buffed up Double Swing. So if you guys remember, Double Swing did get buffed for the Barbarians. Now Double Swing can also provide us with a bit of berserking, which can be really good to become unstoppable. So this is just my theory crafting. I want to jump into enemies and start double swinging at them. And over here, we will be going with high and maximum HP once you have the points. I only have 2 points over here. And I do want to go with Rally Cry. This provides us with bonus movement speed and also 1 free unstoppable for our class. And as we keep going over here, you're going to see I'm going to a lot of movement spells and also a lot of resistance and also reductions to crowd control by 18%. Now because the theme of PvP, we want to have mobility, and we also want to get close to enemies. So charge will allow us to engage with enemies and also knocking them back, and also knocking them down if they're on the wall, right? Which allows Double Swing to do more damage. And over here, I want to go with Leap for the mobility and also the ability to slow enemies. You can leap into enemies or you can leap out of danger. And here we go with some damage reduction while berserking. Now as we come over here, we're going to go to some of the passives that provide us with close range deductions and also more powers when we're close range. And because likely we'll take some damages when we PvP, we can also have some Fortify over here. Now finally for the ultimate, I decided to go with Wrath of Berserker, which allows us to have at least 15 to 20 seconds of Berserk duration because of the passives and also the keystone. And this allows us to become unstoppable. So how you want to play PvP is, you want to get close to enemies with your launch strike and maybe with your charge. And you can disengage with Leap. And once you kind of take away the enemy's cooldowns with unstoppableness, and then you go ham on them. So you go into Berserk mode and they can't stop you, right? And then you start smashing them and also disabling them. Now because we'll be using one hand and likely a mace weapon, so here we'll have increased attack speed for one hand, and also additional damage and also additional chances to stun enemies with one hand weapons, and also two hand weapons. So as a summary, my concept of Barbarian for PvP is to have lots of mobility to engage, disengage, unstoppableness, and also a lot more movement speed with Berserk. Now if I come over to the Druid, my concept of the Druid is going to be quite interesting. I want to be a melee Druid. I know this might not be the best Druid, but I do feel like, if you play World of Warcraft, those feral Druids that's like turned into a cat. I see my friend play, it looks pretty cool. So here we'll be going to a melee Druid that mows down enemies with Shapeshift. So Shapeshift over here allows us to have a little more Fortify and also chance for knockdown. And over here I want to go with Shred because this allows us to kind of launch at enemies for the final attack, and this can gap close as well. Now because we really want one form of unstoppableness, we'll be going with Earthen Bulwark, and this provides us with unstoppable and also Fortify. Now as we fight more enemies, I want to keep enemies stable, or I keep them on the ground, so Poison Creeper will be really nice. Here I only went with 1 point in Poison Creeper, you can go into more points as well for the additional poison bonus. Or if you want to do more crits, you can go for this as well. Now finally, because it will be a werewolf shift-shifting druid, we'll go with Lacterate, which allows us to deal more damage in terms of critical strike and also becomes invulnerable. So this is a defensive offensive capacity, and this is really good at single target damage. So most of the time if you face one players, likely there isn't a lot of things around them, unless it's a Necromancer, right? So if you use this spell, you can deal tremendous damage while avoiding all the damage and also removing the debuffs and also damage over time on yourself. So this will be really good. Now the Druid also has some really good passives, so when you're stunned, you'll become fortified, and when you're controlled, and you also have more fortified, and also more reduction to disables, which will be really good. Now in terms of the keystone, I decided to go with a werewolf spell that deals more damage, and it's fair, right? We'll be going with a bit of werewolf, and here we'll be shift-shifting into different forms, so most of the skills will go into werewolf form. And while we're in werewolf form, we'll also have increased movement speed and also increased close range damage. But here we can also go into werebear form, which allows us to shift and also reduce damage. Now in terms of the spirit bomb choices, I really recommend coming over here to reduce crowd control by 15%. And because we want to deal more damage with melee, we'll go with a 5% critical chance and also 30% critical damage. Now the next character we have is going to be the Necromancer. The theme of the Necromancer is going to be quite interesting. So the first one is Barbarian, it's Mobility, Berserk. The second one is going to be a shift-shifting melee druid. For the Necromancer, we'll go with Unkillable Necromancer. And how we become that is, we'll go with Hemorrhage, and also there's a chance of us to fortify for 100% life. And while we're fortified and while we're having a lot of HP, we'll be dealing additional damage with Blood Surge, and this allows us to deal massive damage with overwhelming blood, which is going to be very powerful when we're very durable. Now in order to keep ourselves unkillable, I decided to go into 5 points into Blood Mist, and also Blood Mist will provide us with more fortify. So in terms of Blood Mist, it really reminds me of the League of Legends hero Vedemir, so he goes into Blood Mist and just lives around, right? So this one will be really fun. And over here, we'll go into more points into Bone Prison. This skill is surprisingly good. Even if enemies are unstoppable, you can still trap them. And while you're trapping them, you can trap them with you as well in the arena. And you also make them vulnerable. Now because we'll be going with somewhat of a melee mage for the Blood Mage, so we take the close range damage reduction and also bonus damage. Now over here, one of the underwhelming or underrated curse for the PvP, I do think will be Decrepify, which allows us to debuff enemies with a massive 51% slow and also a 23.8% less damage. And while enemies are decrepified, they have a chance of being stunned, and also we have a chance of lowering our cooldowns, which means our active spell cooldowns like Bone Prison and also Blood Mist can be lowered for even more disables and also more survivability. Now here we'll be going to all the points into blood section, which allows us to deal more damage, heal more, and also have more chances to be fortified. And finally, if we come over to the ultimate, we can see we'll go with Blood Wave. Blood Wave is not bad, which provides us with a slow. So this is when you become really strong against multiple enemies. So you can try to 1 vs 5 maybe, against multiple players and the monsters, which also leaves behind Blood Orbs. And the theme of the build will be Blood Orbs, allowing us to do overwhelming powers and also damage, and also heal us and also fortify us. Now for this build, I'm planning to only have the Bone Golem, which allows us to take advantage of having less minions and also having no skeleton mages and also warriors, which give us 60% more bonus. And of course, we'll go with a keystone for the Blood Mage for maximum life, and also being healthy means we deal more overpowered damage. So briefly coming over to the sacrificial of the choices, so we'll be sacrificing skeleton minions for less non-physical damage. You can go with critical chance as well, but ideally if you survive long enough, you'll kill the monsters and also enemies. As for the skeleton mages, we'll be sacrificing them for overpowered damage by 40%, which will be amplified by another 60% because of the passives. Now for the last minion, I'm actually contemplating whether I want to use a golem. If I do want to use a golem, the golem can absorb the damage we take by 15%, which can be really good, and this allows us to deal more AoE damage. But on the other hand, if you find yourself short of slots, you can take away the golem, gain maximum life to deal more overpowered damage, but without the golem, it's okay too. You save one active spell, and your damage will be dealt through maximum life. Now coming over to the Rogue. For the Rogue PvP build, I'm going for one offensive Rogue. So unlike the other classes, here we'll be trying to kill enemies before they react. So what you're going to see is we'll be going with Blade Shift, which allows us to have more mobility and also to have more damage reduction and also more resistance and reduction to the crowd control. So this is like an all-in-one PvP kit for the basic spell. Now over here, we'll be going with a Combo Rogue, which allows us to make use of Flurry. Flurry does have some really decent damage. If you compare with Twisting Blade that does long damage over time, Flurry on this side will deal more burst damage, especially with combo point combined with your basic spell. And also Flurry will allow us to stun enemies after evading, which will be really good. Now because I plan to play an offensive rogue, so here for the Shadow Step, we'll go with max level with Shadow Step, dealing more damage and also stunning enemies, which allow us to gap close. We also have lots of passive that reduces damage, and also more passive that allows us to evade after dazing enemies. So here with Dash, we'll go with Dash because it's a really good mobility. This also provides us with more critical strike and also more chance to dash enemies who are slowed. Now as one of the offensive rogues, of course we're going into concealment, which allows us to go into stealth for a few seconds. And while we're stealth, we also have the increase of life regeneration every second. So this heals us for about 36% life. And while we're stealth, we also have ability to critical strike 100%, which allows us to do more damage with backstab or shadow step. Now finally, because we want to kind of focus on PvP and slowing enemies, we'll go with Cold Imbuement, which allows us to do more damage against enemies who are crowd controlled and also a chance of instantly freeze enemies. So we can stun, we can slow, we can daze, we can also freeze enemies, which will be really good. Now here we have some passives for mobility and also passive for maximum life and more damage. And in terms of the final keystone, I want to go with Momentum. Because we'll be focused on slowing enemies, hitting them from behind, this is perfect for us. Damage reduction, energy regeneration, and also movement speed is everything we wanted for PvP. Now finally, we have the sources. I'll say I saved the best last. So here with the sources, we'll be going with the Cold Sources, which has tremendous control power, AoE power, and also survivability. So we'll go with Frostbolt, which allows us to focus on freezing enemies and allows us to deal more damage when enemies are vulnerable. We'll also go with Frozen Orb. This will allow us to clear up waves of monsters and also a lot of players. And this again focuses on the ability to provide vulnerability against enemies. Now as we come over to the defense section for the sources, we can see that teleportation is a must-have, because this also reduces our damage taken by 30%. And because we want to freeze enemies and we're Force Mage, so this one is both offensive, utility, and also defensive. So here we'll be freezing enemies for 3 seconds. And while freezing enemies, this will also make them vulnerable, which will be the theme of the build. Now while we freeze enemies, we can also go with Blizzard, which allows us to deal damage over time and also provide us with a lot of benefits as we go into more free spells. And over here, I am considering to go with more barriers. So one of the legendaries we have will try to have more barriers. And this is of course optional because we can go with the ice armor. So if you find yourself not using one of the skills a lot, let's say if you're not freezing or if you're not teleporting a lot, you can go with ice armor and perk into the more barriers. And finally, we have Deep Freeze, which kind of allows us to have an escape card, which allows us to get out of jail for free and also freeze enemies. So this can be really good. Imagine yourself facing lots of players and monsters. You blink into them, you do the Force Nova, you do some damage, and when they are about to stun you or control you, you go into Deep Freeze, and this removes all the damage and also freezes them. And of course, for the keystone, we'll go with Avalanche, which allows us to have a chance of the next spell to be cast for free and also with more damage. And this is even more doubled with a chance when enemies are vulnerable. So the focus of the Force Mage over here is gonna provide vulnerability, freeze enemies, and then cast spells for free, which can be very powerful. Now in terms of the enchantment choices, I think I can go with Force Bolt, and maybe I can go with the Frozen Orbs, which allows us to have more chances to focus on the freeze part. Now of course we can look into other spells, but I don't think they're that strong. So in terms of the Blizzard, you can have a Blizzard that follows us around, but it's not that offensive, it's more defensive. Now coming back to our last part of the video. Oh boy, I was too ambitious. I didn't know the video took this long going to each of the builds for PvP. So we're gonna briefly talk about hardcore, because I have had messages to ask me about this. But I want to be honest with you guys, I have not played hardcore on Diablo 4, and I do not want to give you guys a misunderstanding of the class of the build, because if you play hardcore and you die, you feel terrible. I don't want that to happen to you guys. So we won't go into depth. I'll give you guys my understanding of the class and also some theory crafting, but I don't want to mislead you guys. So over here you can see my ranking for hardcore. You can see that the source is really high and so are the Druid. Simply because if we come over to the build over here, you can see the Druid has a lot of defensive good spells. Earthen Bulwark, Cyclone Armor, and also the Liberating Roar, which can be very good. And this is also the case for the sources. You have Invulnerability, you have Freeze, you have Armor, you have Teleport. The more defensive you are for hardcore, the better it is I feel, because the longer you survive, the higher level you become, the more items you get. Now this is also the case for the Barbarian and also for the Necromancer. So if we come over to the Barbarians, you can see there's some really good defensive spells, like the Iron Skin, the Rallying Cry, or maybe the Leap and then the Charge, which can get you out of danger. The key is to survive against monsters and also to get away from butchers, right? And similarly, if we come over to the Necromancer, you can see Blood Mist, which is really good. We also have Bone Prison, which can keep ourselves away from enemies. Not to trap ourselves with enemies, of course. Now you guys might be wondering, why do I rank Rogue a little lowly? It's because Rogue is the cast nature and also the ability is very direct towards dealing more damage, mobility, and also dodging. So the problem with dodging is, I'm not saying dodging is a bad thing for Rogue, because Rogue is really good, right? Notice that Rogue have an ability that increase your dodge, and your dexterity will increase your dodge. The problem with dodge in terms of, hardcore is you either take no damage or you take suddenly massive damage, because you don't have as much defensive capacities like armor, like all resistance from the Barbarian and also from the sources. So your main focus is about dodging, and it can be a little RNG. So even if your build is really good and if you play a melee rogue, sometimes you can take lots of damage simply because you're not dodging, and this can be very dangerous. Now because there's a lot of legendaries, lots of uniques for each of the class that can enhance the build, it is hard for me to say which class is going to be the best for hardcore. But ideally, I do think the sources may be the best one for hardcore if you're starting on your first character. But if you do get more items, maybe go with Necromancer, Druid, Barbarian or Rogue. Any class can work once you have more items. So let me know what you guys think about those tier lists and also builds. And if you do have recommendations for PvP and also for hardcore, let us know in the comments as well. Now before you go, and if you guys didn't know, we have a new YouTube channel. And if you guys haven't subscribed, make sure you subscribe and check out the behind the scenes and also fun clips and also more stories about us. And then you get to know me a little more personally instead of just reading the news and also the games, right? So I want to share a little bit more with you guys. So make sure you check this channel out if you're interested about Matt and also Uni. She's really funny too, and she's really shy. So I want to give her a surprise and do a shout out for the new channel to get some subscribers. Thank you guys. I'll see you guys next time.